The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Denver family courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Sarah sat on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom 304, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. She wore her best dress, a navy blue suit that she'd bought years ago for job interviews, hoping that looking professional might somehow influence the judge. It didn't matter that she'd read countless articles about custody cases, watched videos about family law, or spent weeks preparing her testimony. Nothing could have prepared her for the feeling of complete helplessness that now consumed her. Next to her sat her lawyer, James Mitchell, a kind-faced man in his 50s who had taken her case pro after hearing her story. He reviewed his notes one last time, his reading glasses slipping down his nose. "Remember, Sarah," he said gently, "just tell the truth, stick to the facts, don't get emotional." But how could she not get emotional? Her 3-year-old niece, Maya, the daughter of her late sister, was at stake. The child she'd watched grow from birth, whom she'd held in the hospital just hours after she was born. The little girl who used to call her Aunt Sunny in her sweet baby voice. Sarah's sister had died in a car accident 4 years ago. Maya had been just a toddler, barely old enough to form permanent memories. Sarah had been there through everything, the funeral, the legal battles, the complications. She'd watched her brother-in-law struggle with grief, then slowly descend into something darker. The drinking had started subtly, a few beers after work, then more. Then came the erratic mood swings, the sudden rages that terrified everyone around him. Sarah had said nothing at first, not wanting to overstep, but then she began to notice things about Maya. The child who used to be so bright and bubbly had become withdrawn. During family visits, Maya would hide behind Sarah's legs, peeking out nervously. She'd started having nightmares, terrible screaming nightmares that lasted for hours. Sarah had mentioned it gently too, suggesting that maybe Maya had inherited her mother's sensitivity and needed extra attention, had laughed harshly and told her to mind her own business. That's when Sarah knew something was truly wrong. 6 months ago, during a supervised visit at Sarah's apartment, Maya had finally broken down. They were playing with dolls when Maya suddenly threw the toys across the room and started shaking. "Daddy gets loud," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. "Daddy's voice is scary. Mommy's gone. Mommy's not coming back." Sarah's heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces. She'd held the little girl close, rocking her, promising everything would be okay. But would it? That's when Sarah had made the difficult decision to petition the court for emergency custody. His mother, who lived with him and Maya, had sided with him immediately, claiming that Sarah was overreacting and trying to cause problems. "You're just a jealous aunt," his mother had sneered. "You wanted to be Maya's mother and now you're making up stories." The words had stung, but Sarah pressed forward. Now, sitting on the courthouse bench, Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety. She'd spent the last 2 months documenting everything. She'd written down dates, times, specific incidents. She'd gotten a formal evaluation from a child psychologist who had observed the trauma indicators in Maya's behavior. She'd even consulted with the school where Maya attended preschool, and they'd confirmed the behavioral changes they'd observed. But as James had warned her, documenting trauma in a young child was nearly impossible. The physical signs were often invisible, the emotional scars not visible on an X-ray. The doors to the courtroom opened, and a court officer called their names. Sarah stood on shaky legs, James placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. As they walked into the courtroom, she saw sitting at the opposing table with his lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd argued 1,000 custody cases and won them all, wore a carefully constructed expression of concern, his jaw set, his eyes downcast as if deeply troubled by these false accusations. He looked every inch the wronged father. The judge, the Honorable Richard, was a man in his 60s with gray hair and reading glasses that sat perpetually on the bridge of his nose. He had the weathered appearance of someone who had seen it all: too many cases, too many claims, too many lies told in courtrooms. Sarah knew from her research that he had a reputation for being skeptical of custody petitions, especially those brought by extended family members. Grandparents and aunts come in here all the time, one legal forum had stated, claiming abuse but really just wanting to take over parenting duties. As the hearing began, Sarah felt her voice shake as she explained her concerns, her observations, the specific incidents she documented. She spoke about the nightmares, the behavioral changes, the way Maya had become afraid of loud voices. She talked about the drinking she'd witnessed, the angry outbursts she'd heard through apartment walls. The judge listened with an expression that seemed to grow more skeptical by the minute. Then's lawyer stood up. He was brutal and efficient. He suggested that Sarah's observations were subjective. The nightmares could be normal childhood anxieties. The behavioral changes could be from missing her mother. He pointed out that Sarah had no concrete evidence of abuse, no hospital records, no bruises, no obvious physical harm. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "Ms. is asking this court to remove a child from her father's care based on vague suspicions and her interpretation of normal childhood behavior. This appears to be a case of family conflict, not child endangerment." When the judge called for recess before his decision, Sarah felt her heart sink. She'd seen his expression, the subtle shifts in his skepticism. As they waited, she noticed people in the hallway smirking at her. A woman in the bathroom had overheard part of the testimony and made a comment about people who made up stories for attention. When the judge returned, his decision was crushing. "I find the evidence insufficient to warrant emergency custody intervention," he announced in a flat, matter-of-fact voice. "While I acknowledge Ms.'s concerns, there is no concrete proof of abuse. The mother's death was clearly traumatic for this child, and her behavioral changes could be attributed to that loss rather than parental neglect. Custody remains with the biological father." The courtroom filled with whispers. Sarah heard a stifled laugh from the back row. The lawyer was already shaking his hand, congratulating him. As Sarah stood to leave, feeling the weight of defeat crushing her, she noticed a bulletin board near the courthouse exit. Pinned among various notices and flyers was a small, colorful card with a picture of a dog and a child. "Voices Without Words," it read. "Therapy dogs for children in crisis." Sarah took the flyer with trembling hands. As she walked out into the Denver sunshine, tears streaming down her face, she felt a spark of desperate hope. The court system had failed her. The judge hadn't listened. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Maybe she hadn't lost this battle yet. She looked at the flyer again, at the gentle eyes of the dog pictured there, and whispered a prayer. "Please," she said to the universe, "please let this work. Please let me save her." As Sarah drove home, she dialed the number on the flyer. A warm voice answered, and Sarah's voice broke as she explained her situation. The woman on the other end, who introduced herself as, listened without interruption. When Sarah finished, said something that rekindled a fragile hope. "We might be able to help you. Tell me everything about your niece." Sarah's hands shook as she dialed the number on the flyer. She sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot, the phone pressed to her ear, her heart pounding with a fragile hope that felt almost dangerous. What if this didn't work either? What if this was just another dead end in an endless maze of disappointments? "Voices Without Words," a warm, compassionate voice answered. "This is speaking. How can I help you today?" Sarah's voice cracked as she introduced herself. She tried to explain her situation logically, professionally, but within moments, the words came tumbling out in an emotional torrent. She told about Maya, about the court case, about her desperate need to help her niece. She spoke about the therapy dog program, about how she'd read that animals could help traumatized children communicate their feelings. She confessed that she didn't have much money but would pay whatever she could. She was rambling, she knew, but she couldn't stop herself. Listened patiently, never interrupting, never rushing her. When Sarah finally fell silent, exhausted from her emotional outpouring, spoke with a gentleness that made fresh tears spring to Sarah's eyes. "You're doing the right thing," said firmly, "and we want to help you. What you're describing, a child showing trauma responses, withdrawal, behavioral changes, these are exactly the situations where therapy dogs have shown remarkable results. When can you come to our office?" 3 days later, Sarah sat in the warm, welcoming office of Voices Without Words in a renovated Victorian house on the outskirts of Denver. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and there were photographs everywhere, dogs with children, children's artwork, testimonials from families. Despite the professional appearance, there was an almost homey quality to the space. Sarah could hear barking from somewhere in the back, and the air smelled faintly of dog treats and natural pine cleanser. Emerged from a back room, and Sarah was immediately struck by her presence. She was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and kind, intelligent eyes. She wore a sweater with a dog embroidered on it, and there was an air of authenticity about her that made Sarah trust her immediately. Behind came a beautiful golden retriever, whose tail was wagging so hard her entire back end was wiggling. "This is Honey," said, introducing the dog. "She's one of our senior facilitators, but I don't think she's the right match for Maya. Come, let me show you what we do here, and then we'll talk about whether a therapy dog is right for your situation." Led Sarah through the office, explaining the program's philosophy. "Therapy dogs aren't about performing tricks or providing entertainment," explained. "They're about creating a safe emotional space where children can process their feelings. Dogs don't judge. They don't have agendas. They don't criticize. For a traumatized child, a dog can be a bridge to emotional expression that words alone cannot facilitate." She showed Sarah several case studies, children who had experienced abuse, neglect, or loss. There was a boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years after witnessing his parents' violent divorce. Within 3 months of working with a therapy dog, he'd started communicating again. There was a girl who'd been physically abused and had severe trust issues with adults. The dog had helped her relearn what unconditional love and safety felt like. The results were profound and often transformative. But cautioned, "We take this very seriously. We don't just match any child with any dog. We need to understand the child's specific needs, the family's situation, and whether a therapy dog will genuinely help. I also need to understand your motivations, Sarah. I'm not asking this unkindly, but I need to know that you're not trying to use a dog as a prop in a custody battle. That wouldn't be fair to the child or the animal." Sarah Metz gazed directly. "I'm not trying to use Jasper as a prop," she said, and then paused. She hadn't yet learned the dog's name, hadn't told her. "I mean, I don't know which dog yet, but what I want is for Maya to feel safe. What I want is for her to have a way to express what she's feeling that adults might not understand. If a dog can help her do that, and if that helps her voice be heard in court, then yes, that's important to me. But more important than anything is that Maya heals, that she knows she's not alone." His expression softened and Sarah saw something shift in her eyes. "That's the right answer," said quietly. "Come with me. I want to introduce you to someone." They walked through a hallway lined with photographs of dogs, their medical records, their stories. Explained that they worked with rescue organizations and breed-specific rescues to find dogs whose temperaments suited therapy work. They looked for dogs with certain qualities: patience, gentleness, intuitive emotional awareness, and crucially, an ability to remain calm in uncertain situations. The back room contained several enclosures and a large, open play area. Several dogs were resting in comfortable beds, and a few were playing with toys. Walked Sarah to one particular enclosure where an older golden retriever lay sleeping in a patch of sunlight. His fur was a beautiful cream color, darkening to gold around his ears and face. He had a dignified appearance, as if he'd already lived a full and meaningful life. "This is Jasper," said softly. "He's 8 years old, which makes him a senior dog. He was originally trained as a service dog for a woman with PTSD. He did remarkable work for 7 years. But his handler passed away 6 months ago, and the woman's family reached out to us because Jasper was grieving deeply. They knew he needed a new purpose. We've been rehabilitating him, helping him process his own loss, and I believe he's now ready to help others process theirs." As if on cue, Jasper opened his eyes. He didn't jump up or rush toward them. He simply lifted his head and looked at with an expression of profound gentleness. Then his eyes moved to Sarah, and something inexplicable passed between them. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "Tell me about Maya," said. "Her age, her behaviors, what trauma she's experienced." Sarah sat down on a bench near Jasper's enclosure and told everything. She described Maya's shyness, her withdrawal, her nightmares. She talked about how the little girl had become afraid of loud voices, how she'd lost her sparkle. She explained the loss of her mother, the difficult home environment, the way Maya had begun to retreat from the world. Listened and watched Jasper, who had quietly stood up and padded over to sit near Sarah's feet. He rested his head against her knee, not seeking attention but simply offering presence. Sarah, without thinking, reached down and stroked his soft fur. In that moment, something shifted inside her. "I think Jasper might be exactly what Maya needs," said thoughtfully. "He knows loss. He knows grief. He understands the value of a safe presence, and children respond to that authenticity. They can sense when an animal truly understands their pain because that animal has felt pain too." Sarah looked down at the dog resting against her knee, and for the first time since the court hearing, she felt a glimmer of genuine hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of before, but something quieter and more profound. Maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. Maybe this old dog who had lost his purpose had found a new one. And maybe, through Jasper, little Maya might finally find her voice. "What do I need to do?" Sarah asked. Smiled, a warm, knowing smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this question. "First," she said, "we need to do a thorough evaluation. I need to understand your home, your daily life, your support system. Then if everything checks out, we'll introduce you and Maya to Jasper. We'll do this slowly and carefully. There's no rush. This is about building trust, not about racing toward a deadline." "But the court case," Sarah began. "We'll wait," interrupted gently. "What matters first is that Maya finds safety and learns to express herself. Everything else flows from that foundation. Trust me on this, Sarah. I've been doing this for 23 years, and I've learned that when you put the child's healing first, everything else falls into place." As Sarah left the office that afternoon, walking back to her car with adoption paperwork tucked under her arm and Jasper's photo on her phone, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: possibility. Not certainty, but possibility. And in that moment, that was enough. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's first meeting with Jasper. 2 weeks of applications, home evaluations, and careful preparation. Had visited Sarah's apartment, examining everything from the safety of her living space to her support network. She'd asked detailed questions about Sarah's work schedule, her emotional stability, her capacity to handle a dog and a traumatized child simultaneously. Had even spoken to Sarah's therapist, confirming that Sarah was psychologically equipped to handle the stress of caring for both an anxious animal and a traumatized child. Now, on a warm Friday afternoon in late March, Sarah sat in her apartment with her heart racing, was arriving in 30 minutes with Jasper. Sarah had prepared meticulously, clearing space in her living room, setting up a comfortable dog bed near the windows where Jasper could watch the world, ensuring everything was calm and welcoming. She'd also called to confirm that her supervised visitation with Maya was still scheduled for this afternoon. Surprisingly, had agreed with minimal fuss. Had suggested that initial meetings between Maya and Jasper should happen in Sarah's home, a neutral, safe space where neither the child nor the dog would feel threatened or territorial. When arrived, she carried Jasper on a lead, and the dog moved with the same dignified calmness Sarah remembered from their first meeting. Jasper's cream-colored fur gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and his eyes were alert but gentle. Spent 30 minutes showing Sarah how to interact with Jasper, how to read his body language, how to recognize when he needed space or when he was ready to engage. She explained that Jasper would need time to adjust to the apartment, to understand that this was now part of his territory and routine. "Let him explore," advised. "Don't force anything. The most powerful thing about Jasper is his presence, not any tricks or forced interactions. Just let Maya and Jasper discover each other naturally." By 2:45 p.m., Jasper had settled into his new home, sniffing every corner of the apartment and finally curling up in his bed by the window. Sarah's hands were trembling as she heard Scar pull up outside. She took a deep breath and went downstairs to meet them. Maya stood beside her father, wearing a pale pink dress and holding a small stuffed rabbit. Her hair was neatly braided, and she looked smaller than Sarah remembered, as if grief and stress had physically diminished her. When Maya saw Sarah, she managed a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a wariness there, a guardedness that broke Sarah's heart. "Come on, sweetie," Sarah said gently, extending her hand. "I have someone special I want you to meet." Maya glanced up at her father, who gave an approving nod. The little girl took Sarah's hand, and they climbed the stairs to the apartment. Remained downstairs in the common area, as per the supervised visitation agreement. As they entered the apartment, Jasper lifted his head from his bed. He didn't jump up or rush toward them. He simply watched with calm, patient eyes as Sarah and Maya came inside. Sarah knelt down beside Maya, keeping her hand on the child's shoulder. "This is my friend Jasper," Sarah said softly. "He's a very special dog, and I think he'd like to meet you. But we're going to let him come to us, okay? We won't rush." For several minutes, nothing happened. Jasper remained in his bed, and Maya stood rigid, barely breathing. Sarah sat down on the floor near Jasper and began to stroke his fur gently. She spoke to him in a low voice about the beautiful afternoon, about how happy she was that he was here, about how patient and kind he was. She wasn't really talking to Jasper at all. She was modeling behavior for Maya, showing her that it was safe, that Jasper was trustworthy. Then something remarkable happened. Jasper slowly stood up and walked toward them. His gait was deliberate and gentle, not threatening in any way. He approached Sarah first, rested his head briefly against her shoulder, and then turned his attention to Maya. The dog didn't jump on the child or try to lick her face. Instead, he simply sat down directly in front of her, his golden eyes meeting hers. Maya gasped softly. Her small hand, which had been clenched in a fist, slowly relaxed. With infinite slowness, she reached out one tiny finger and touched Jasper's fur. Then another finger. Then her entire hand was pressed against his side. "Hi, Jasper," she whispered, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the sound of wonder in the child's voice. For the next hour, something magical unfolded. Maya didn't pet Jasper aggressively or try to play with him in typical ways. Instead, she simply sat beside him, stroking his fur with gentle, reverent movements. She buried her face in his neck and breathed in his scent. At one point, she lay down beside him, and Jasper curled around her protectively. Sarah documented everything with her phone camera, not intrusively, but capturing the genuine moments of connection. "Jasper is soft," Maya said at one point, running her small hand over his ears. "He is," Sarah agreed. "And he's very kind. He likes you very much." "He's not loud," Maya observed. "He doesn't yell." Sarah's heart squeezed. That simple statement contained so much. The child's fear of loud voices, her desperate need for calm and safety, and her recognition that Jasper provided that. Over the following weeks, Sarah's supervised visitations with Maya transformed completely. What had previously been stilted, careful interactions became natural and joyful. Maya would arrive at Sarah's apartment, and the first thing she'd do was rush to Jasper, throwing her small arms around his neck. The dog, with remarkable patience and intuition, would remain still during these enthusiastic greetings, accepting the child's affection as if he understood the profound need behind it. Sarah began documenting everything systematically. She kept a detailed journal of each visit, noting specific behavioral changes. She recorded video footage showing Maya's transformation from a withdrawn, anxious child to one who smiled freely and engaged with the world. She filmed Maya talking to Jasper, confiding in the dog things she wouldn't tell adults. "Daddy was very loud yesterday," Maya told Jasper during one visit, stroking his ears. "He was angry. It scared me." Jasper responded by pressing closer to the child, offering his solid, calm presence. Sarah, filming from a distance, captured the moment with tears running down her face. This was testimony more powerful than anything she could say in court. 3 months into working with Jasper, Maya had a remarkable transformation. The nightmares happened less frequently. Her appetite improved. She started drawing pictures again, something she hadn't done in nearly a year. Most significantly, she began to smile genuinely, her eyes lighting up with the kind of joy that only a 3-year-old can experience. The preschool teacher called Sarah one afternoon. "I don't know what you're doing," she said, "but Maya is like a different child. She's participating in activities now. She's making friends. She's happy. Whatever's changed, keep doing it." Sarah purchased a professional video camera and began filming more formally. She documented Jasper's responses to Maya's emotional states, how the dog seemed to sense when the child was anxious and would press closer, how he would rest his head on her lap when she was sad, how he celebrated her joys with a gentle enthusiasm. She also kept detailed notes, creating a comprehensive record of Maya's behavioral changes. One afternoon, as Maya napped with her head on Jasper's side, Sarah looked at all the documentation she'd gathered and felt a surge of purpose. The court had dismissed her concerns, had laughed at her, but here was the evidence, undeniable and powerful. Here was a child healing. Here was a child learning to trust, to feel safe, to express her emotions. And here was an old dog who had found new meaning in his life through helping this vulnerable child. The second court hearing was still months away, but Sarah now felt prepared in a way she hadn't before. She had more than just a theory or concern. She had documented proof of transformation, professional testimony from therapy dog specialists, and most importantly, she had a 3-year-old child who was slowly learning to find her voice. As she watched Maya sleep peacefully, her small hand still resting on Jasper's warm body, Sarah whispered a quiet thank you to the dog who had given her hope when hope seemed impossible. Whatever came next, whatever the court decided, Maya had already been healed in the most profound way possible. She had learned that safety was real, that love was unconditional, and that sometimes the most powerful voice belongs to a dog who asks nothing but offers everything. Sarah hadn't slept the night before the second court hearing. She'd reviewed her documentation so many times that the pages were beginning to show wear from handling. Video after video played through her mind. Maya laughing with Jasper, Maya opening up about her fears, Maya's transformation from a withdrawn shell of a child to someone filled with joy and trust. She had months of evidence now, professional psychological evaluations, testimony from Maya's preschool teacher, and comprehensive notes from At Voices Without Words. Surely, she thought, the judge would see what was so obvious to everyone around her. Surely he would understand what the therapy dog had accomplished. At 7:00 a.m., Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror wearing the same navy suit she'd worn to the first hearing. She looked haunted, dark circles under her eyes, her usually vibrant skin pale from weeks of stress. She applied makeup carefully, trying to project competence and stability even though she felt anything but stable. In the other room, Jasper rested calmly in his bed, seemingly oblivious to the tension that permeated the apartment. Sarah had dropped Maya off with her friend Jennifer the night before. The child couldn't attend this hearing. That was probably for the best, Sarah thought. She didn't want Maya subjected to the hostile environment of the courtroom again. James met her outside the courthouse at 8:30 a.m. He looked more optimistic than he had before the first hearing, which gave Sarah a fragile sense of hope. He carried a leather briefcase containing all of her documentation, the videos on a portable hard drive, printed copies of the psychological evaluations, letters of support from the preschool, a comprehensive report on Maya's progress. "This is good work," James said, patting the briefcase. "This is real evidence of behavioral change. The judge will have to take this seriously." Inside the courtroom, and his lawyer were already seated, looked relaxed, almost confident. His lawyer, the same slick man from before, glanced at Sarah's documentation with an expression of mild amusement. That should have been Sarah's first warning that something was wrong. The hearing began with Sarah presenting her new evidence. James carefully walked through the timeline, the initial court decision, the introduction of the therapy dog, the months of documented progress. He presented video clips showing Maya's transformation. He played audio of Maya's own words describing her feelings of safety with Jasper. The psychological evaluation was presented, highlighting the clear indicators of trauma that had begun to resolve. Sarah felt a surge of confidence as she watched the judge's expression. He seemed genuinely interested, leaning forward as the videos played. This was going to work. Finally, someone was listening. Then's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "What we're hearing today is in confirmation bias and parental alienation. Ms. has spent the last 6 months attempting to establish a relationship with her niece specifically because she lost her initial custody petition. She has invested significant time and resources into creating the appearance of trauma where, quite frankly, there is none." Sarah's stomach dropped. The lawyer continued, his tone becoming increasingly dismissive. "Let's be clear about what we're seeing here. A 3-year-old child who has lost her mother, a tragic circumstance, is being given a dog by her aunt. Is it any surprise that the child enjoys spending time with this dog? Is it any surprise that the child is happy and relaxed in her aunt's home? Children are adaptable. They enjoy novelty, but this is not evidence of abuse in the father's home." He began attacking the validity of the psychological evaluation. The psychologist in question has never met with the child in her father's home. She's only observed the child in the aunt's carefully controlled environment. How can she possibly assess whether the child is traumatized by the father's parenting when she has no baseline comparison? "Furthermore," he said, his voice taking on a more sinister tone, "there's significant literature on the phenomenon of adults using animals to manipulate children's emotions and behavior. Is it possible that Ms. is exploiting this child's attachment to an animal to serve her own agenda?" The judge, who had seemed engaged moments before, began nodding slowly, his expression becoming skeptical once more. James stood to object, but the lawyer pressed on. "I would also like to remind the court that in our first hearing, the judge appropriately noted that Ms. presented no concrete evidence of abuse. Nothing presented today changes that fundamental fact. There are no hospital records, no documentation of physical harm, no involvement of child protective services. What we have is the subjective interpretation of a child's behavior by an aunt who admits she is seeking custody." "That's not fair," Sarah whispered, but nobody heard her. The lawyer then presented his own witnesses. His mother, who that was a dedicated father and that Sarah was a jealous aunt trying to cause family conflict. A neighbor, who said he'd never seen any concerning behavior at home. His boss, who described him as a responsible man. Each testimony was delivered with practiced precision, each one carefully designed to paint a picture of a man wrongly accused and a vindictive relative trying to separate a father from his child. When himself took the stand, he was the picture of wounded confusion. "I don't understand why my sister-in-law is doing this," he said, his voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. "I love my daughter more than anything in the world. Yes, I've had some struggles since died. We all have, but I've never harmed Maya. I've never done anything but try to be a good father to her. I think Sarah resents that I've moved on, that I'm building a new life, and she's using this dog situation to try to sabotage me." It was a masterful performance. He looked like a man victimized by a vindictive relative. The judge's expression had shifted completely. Sarah could see the doubt creeping back into his eyes, the skepticism hardening into certainty. When it was Sarah's turn to testify again, she felt defeated before she even began. She tried to explain that the therapy dog wasn't about manipulation. It was about giving Maya a safe way to express her emotions. She described specific incidents of Maya's trauma responses. She talked about the child's nightmares and her fear of loud voices. But the lawyer was waiting. "Ms., he said smoothly, "let me ask you directly. Have you ever taken your niece to the police, to Child Protective Services, or to a hospital because of abuse? Have you filed any reports with authorities? No, Sarah admitted quietly, because the signs of trauma are emotional, not physical. So you're basing your entire custody petition on your interpretation of a child's emotions, he said. Not on any objective evidence of abuse, but on your subjective belief that something is wrong. Is that correct? That's not fair, Sarah started, but the judge held up his hand. I've heard enough, Judge announced. His voice was cold, final. I find the evidence presented today to be insufficient to warrant a change in custody arrangements. Ms., while I appreciate your concern for your niece, I cannot remove a child from her father's care based on subjective interpretations of behavioral responses. The presence of a therapy dog, while perhaps comforting to the child, does not constitute evidence of abuse or endangerment in the biological father's home. Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Furthermore, the judge continued, I must address the court's growing concern about the nature of this petition. Ms., you need to understand that continued accusations without concrete evidence could result in you losing supervised visitation rights altogether. I'm warning you, one more unfounded petition, and I will consider restricting your access to your niece. The gavel came down with devastating finality. His lawyer shook his hand, congratulating him. In the back row, someone actually laughed. Sarah sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. As they left the courtroom, a court officer made eye contact with Sarah and literally rolled his eyes at her. Outside, reporters who had gathered to cover the unusual case thrust microphones in her direction, asking if she was planning to appeal. James put his arm around her and guided her away, but not before she heard one reporter say to another, "She's clearly just trying to cause trouble for this poor father." In the car, Sarah broke down completely. She had presented months of documentation, professional evaluations, and clear evidence of a child's transformation, and the court had dismissed it. Worse, the judge had warned her that another attempt could cost her access to Maya entirely. She'd been backed into a corner, silenced by the very system that was supposed to protect vulnerable children. James drove her home in silence, knowing that nothing he could say would help. As Sarah walked into her apartment, Jasper came to greet her, and she sank to the floor beside the old dog, her body racked with sobs. The court had laughed at her again, and this time it felt like they'd stolen her only remaining hope. But Jasper rested his head on her lap, his warm presence a silent reminder that sometimes the most powerful truths cannot be spoken in courtrooms. Sometimes they can only be lived, experienced, and felt. Sarah held the dog close, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if bringing Jasper into this situation had ultimately made things worse instead of better. As the sun set outside her window, Sarah sat in darkness, feeling more defeated than she ever had before. The week following the court hearing was the darkest period of Sarah's life. She called in sick to work, something she rarely did, and spent her days in a fog of despair. Jasper seemed to sense her emotional state, staying close to her side, resting his head on her lap, offering comfort without judgment. But even the dog's presence couldn't lift the crushing weight of defeat. The judge's warning echoed in her mind constantly. One more petition, and she'd lose visitation rights entirely. She'd be cut off from Maya completely. The thought was unbearable. On Friday morning, 2 days before what would have been her next scheduled visitation with Maya, Sarah's phone rang. It was James, her attorney. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Can you come to my office?" Sarah arrived at his downtown Denver law office at 2:00 p.m. James's secretary brought them coffee, and James closed the door to his office, creating a private space for a conversation he clearly knew would be delicate. He sat across from her, his expression thoughtful and concerned. "I know you're devastated," he began. The judge's decision was disappointing and his warning was harsh. "But I've been thinking about this case from every angle and I have an idea. It's unconventional, it's risky, but I think it might be our only option." Sarah looked up, too emotionally exhausted to hope, but unable to completely extinguish the spark. James took a deep breath. What if we brought Jasper into the courtroom? Sarah stared at him. I'm sorry, what? I know it sounds crazy, James continued quickly. But hear me out. There's a growing body of law around emotional support animals in legal proceedings. We're not talking about a service dog performing specific tasks. We're talking about an animal whose presence is therapeutically necessary for a witness's emotional well-being and ability to communicate. There's actually precedent for this, particularly in family law cases involving children. But the judge will never allow it, Sarah said. He'll see it as a circus, as exactly what he accused me of, theatrical manipulation. Probably, James agreed. Which is why we have to make a legal argument so compelling that he can't refuse. We need to frame this not as a gimmick, but as a reasonable accommodation for a child's documented emotional needs. Over the next hour, James outlined his strategy. They would file a formal motion requesting permission for Maya to bring her emotional support animal to the hearing. They would argue that Jasper wasn't just a pet. He was a documented therapeutic tool that had been professionally matched to Maya by a legitimate nonprofit organization. They would cite recent case law about emotional support animals in family court proceedings. They would emphasize that denying Maya access to her emotional support animal could be psychologically harmful and might even be considered a violation of her emotional well-being. The key, James said, is to make this about Maya's needs, not about your strategy. We have to argue that this isn't a stunt, it's a necessity. Sarah listened, feeling something shift inside her. It was a long shot, a desperate, probably futile long shot, but it was a shot. The motion was filed the following Monday. His lawyer responded immediately with a blistering opposition brief that called the request a transparent attempt to inject an emotional element into legal proceedings, and a thinly veiled manipulation tactic designed to prejudice the court. He argued that allowing a dog in the courtroom would set a dangerous precedent and would undermine the solemnity and authority of judicial proceedings. For 3 weeks, the motion was pending. Sarah existed in a state of anxious limbo. She continued her supervised visitations with Maya, but she didn't tell the child about the legal fight happening behind the scenes. Instead, she cherished each moment with her niece, never knowing if it might be their last. Then, to everyone's shock, the judge ruled, not in an order but in a brief notation in the court file. Motion for emotional support animal in courtroom approved, subject to the following conditions. 1. The animal must be completely silent during proceedings. 2. The animal must be under the complete control of the handler at all times. 3. Any behavioral issues from the animal will result in immediate removal and contempt of court charges for violating court orders. 4. This is a one-time exception and does not constitute precedent for future cases. Sarah read the order 3 times to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. They'd won. It was a conditional victory, filled with restrictions and warnings, but they'd won. She immediately called at Voices without words. We need to prepare Jasper, Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. We need to make absolutely sure he can handle being in a courtroom. Was cautiously optimistic. Jasper has been in hospitals, office buildings, even airports during his service dog training, she said. But a courtroom is a unique environment. The tension, the formal proceedings, the loud voices, it's all very different from anything he's experienced as a therapeutic animal. For the next 6 weeks, worked intensively with Jasper, preparing him for the courtroom environment. She created simulations, having other people raise their voices in heated arguments while Jasper remained calm beside Maya. She practiced having the child sit in formal positions for extended periods while the dog maintained composure. She even arranged for them to visit an actual courtroom during off hours, allowing Jasper to become familiar with the space, the layout, the acoustic properties. The challenge, explained to Sarah, is that Jasper needs to remain not just calm but emotionally present for Maya. If the dog shuts down or becomes stressed, that defeats the purpose. He needs to be offering emotional support and comfort while also being completely silent and non-disruptive. Sarah also began intensive preparation with Maya. She took the child to visit the courthouse, showing her the courtroom where they would be. She explained in age-appropriate language that there would be people in the room, that there might be some loud voices, but that Jasper would be right there beside her. "Jasper will help me feel safe?" Maya asked, her small hand clutching Sarah's. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "Jasper will be your helper. He'll help you tell the people in the room about your feelings." As the date of the final hearing approached, now set for 6 weeks away, Sarah felt a transformation happening within herself. She was no longer the desperate, defeated woman who had left the courthouse in tears. She was focused, purposeful, and strategically prepared. But she was also terrified. The judge's conditions were stringent. One mistake, one sound from Jasper, and the entire case could blow up in her face. This lawyer would undoubtedly use any dog misbehavior as evidence that Sarah was using the animal as a manipulation tool. 2 weeks before the hearing, Sarah met with both and James to do a final preparation. They sat in a conference room in James's office and brought Jasper so they could practice the actual court environment as closely as possible. "Remember," said to Sarah, "Jasper will sense your anxiety. You need to be calm and centered. He'll feed off your energy." James added, "This is our last real chance. After this hearing, if we don't succeed, the judge will likely impose restrictions that prevent you from seeking custody again. This has to work." Sarah looked at Jasper, who sat calmly beside Maya, his gentle eyes reflecting absolute faith and trust. She thought about how far they'd come, from a courtroom where people had laughed at her to this moment, where she had actually gotten a judge to allow a therapy dog in his courtroom. It was unprecedented locally. It was risky. It was probably crazy. But sometimes, when the system has failed you completely, when all conventional paths have been closed off, you have to take a crazy chance. Sarah reached down and stroked Jasper's soft ears. "We're going to do this," she whispered. "We're going to make them listen." The old dog rested his head against her leg, as if he understood exactly what was at stake. And in that moment, surrounded by compassionate expertise, James's legal acumen, and Jasper's unwavering presence, Sarah felt something she thought she'd lost forever: genuine hope. The morning of the final hearing arrived with brilliant Colorado sunshine that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. Sarah woke at 5:00 a.m., unable to sleep despite having taken a mild sedative the night before. She lay in bed, her mind racing through every possible scenario: what could go wrong, what might happen, how she would react if the judge ruled against her again. Beside her on the nightstand sat her phone, displaying the time in large, glowing numbers. 6:47 a.m. The hearing would begin at 9:00 a.m. She got out of bed and moved to the living room, where Jasper was already awake, his golden eyes tracking her movements with the intuitive awareness of a dog who sensed the importance of the day. Sarah sat beside him on the floor, pressing her forehead against his, breathing in his familiar scent. "Today's the day," she whispered. "Today we fight for her." Jasper pressed his head against hers, offering the kind of comfort that only an animal who understands true suffering can provide. Sarah spent an hour just sitting with him, drawing strength from his calm presence. At 7:30 a.m., she showered and dressed carefully. She'd chosen her outfit deliberately, professional but not intimidating, approachable but competent. A charcoal gray suit with a pale blue blouse. She wore minimal jewelry and no perfume, had advised her to be as neutral as possible, to let Jasper and Maya be the focus, not any external elements that might distract. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 a.m. to pick up Maya. Jennifer, Sarah's friend who had been helping care for Maya during the legal proceedings, opened her door with the child already dressed and ready. Maya wore a soft lavender dress, her hair braided neatly, her small face serious and thoughtful. She'd been prepared carefully for this day. "Is Jasper coming?" Maya asked as Sarah buckled her into the car seat. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah confirmed. "Jasper will be there with you. He's going to help you today." "I'm going to tell them about Daddy's loud voice," Maya said with the serious determination only a 3-year-old can muster. Sarah's heart clenched. "That's right, honey. You're going to tell them the truth about how you feel." They drove to the courthouse in relative silence, with only soft music playing on the radio. Sarah tried to appear calm for Maya's sake, but her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. This was it. This was everything. When they arrived at the courthouse, Sarah immediately noticed the increased security and media presence. News vans were parked outside, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky. This case had attracted attention. The story of an aunt fighting to protect a child with the help of a therapy dog had captured people's imagination. There were at least a dozen reporters gathered outside the courthouse steps, along with several camera crews. Sarah took a deep breath and carefully guided Maya through the crowd, shielding the child from the cameras. "No comment," she said firmly as reporters thrust microphones in her direction. "We're here for my niece's well-being, not for publicity." Inside the courthouse, she met James in the hallway outside courtroom 304. He looked more nervous than she'd ever seen him, his usual confidence tempered by the weight of what was at stake. Behind him came, carrying Jasper on a professional leather leash. The dog was immaculately groomed, his cream-colored fur gleaming, his demeanor perfectly calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "This is it," James said, gripping Sarah's shoulder. "Remember what we discussed. Let Maya's truth be the focus. Let Jasper do what he does best, provide her with safety and presence. The judge needs to see that this isn't about a gimmick. This is about a child who has been given the tools to express her reality." Adjusted Jasper's leash and looked at Sarah and Maya seriously. "Remember, Sarah, stay centered. Jasper will sense any anxiety from you and it could affect his behavior. Maya, sweetheart," she addressed the little girl gently, "you have Jasper right here. Whenever you feel scared or nervous, just touch Jasper's fur. He's your helper today." At 8:55 a.m., court security began allowing people into the courtroom. Sarah was shocked to see how packed it was. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Journalists, interested advocates, law students, even a few other attorneys who had come to witness what was being called the therapy dog case. She saw sitting at the opposing table with his expensive lawyer, who was looking supremely confident, almost smug. Was dressed in a careful performance of fatherhood, a simple button-down shirt, hair neatly combed, an expression of concerned dignity. Judge entered at 9:00 a.m. sharp. His eyes immediately went to Jasper, and his expression hardened with clear disapproval. "I trust," he said sternly, "that we all understand the conditions under which this animal is being permitted in my courtroom. Any disturbance, any sound, any behavioral issue whatsoever, and this dog will be removed, and I will consider this a violation of court orders. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," James replied firmly. The hearing began with opening statements from both sides. His lawyer launched immediately into his prepared argument about how Sarah was using the dog as a manipulation tactic, how she was coaching Maya to say things she didn't understand, how this entire situation was an example of parental alienation at its most manipulative. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we have a father who has worked tirelessly to provide a stable home for his daughter after the tragic loss of her mother. And we have a woman who, having failed in her initial custody petition, has now resorted to theatrical displays designed to prejudice the court against a loving parent. The introduction of an animal into these proceedings is not evidence. It is not testimony. It is manipulation." Then came the testimony. Sarah's psychologist presented her findings, the trauma indicators, the behavioral patterns consistent with exposure to an unstable or threatening environment, the documented improvement in Maya's symptoms since working with the therapy dog. The psychologist was articulate and professional, her testimony grounded in psychological research and clinical observation. The lawyer attacked ruthlessly. "Doctor, you've never observed this child in her father's home, have you? You've only observed her in her aunt's home, under her aunt's supervision, with a dog her aunt provided. How can you possibly speak to what occurs in the father's home when you've never been there?" The psychologist remained calm. "I can only speak to what I've observed, and what I've observed is consistent with a child who has experienced significant emotional stress and has found therapeutic relief through her relationship with the dog." Then came testimony from, representing Voices Without Words. She explained the rigorous process of matching therapy dogs to children, the documented benefits of animal-assisted therapy for trauma, and the significant improvement she documented in Maya's behavioral and emotional responses. This dog, firmly, was not placed with this child for entertainment or manipulation. He was placed with her because a licensed organization determined that he could help her process trauma and express emotions she wasn't able to verbalize. The remarkable progress we've documented is not manufactured. It's real, measurable, and verifiable. As Sarah watched the judge's expression, he seemed less dismissive than before, but still skeptical. The lawyer was particularly aggressive with, trying to paint the organization as complicit in Sarah's alleged scheme. Then came the preschool teacher's testimony, confirming the dramatic behavioral changes she'd observed in Maya. The lawyer questioned whether the teacher had witnessed any actual abuse or just normal childhood behavior. The teacher stood firm, but Sarah could see doubt creeping into the judge's eyes again. By late morning, Sarah felt the familiar crushing weight of impending defeat. The evidence was strong, but the judge still seemed to view it all through a lens of skepticism. She watched Maya, who sat quietly beside Jasper, her small hand resting on the dog's back. The child was calm, protected by the dog's presence, but Sarah worried that it wouldn't be enough. Then's lawyer announced his final witness, himself. Took the stand with practiced confidence. He wore an expression of wounded confusion, as if he couldn't understand why these terrible accusations were being leveled against him. His lawyer guided him through his testimony gently, allowing him to paint a picture of himself as a devoted father struggling with grief, but never, ever engaging in behavior that would harm his daughter. "I love Maya more than anything in the world," his voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. "I've never raised my voice to her in anger. I've never done anything but try to provide her with a stable, loving home. I don't understand these accusations. I don't understand why my sister-in-law has become so obsessed with taking my daughter away from me." It was a masterful performance. The judge seemed moved by his testimony, nodding slightly at several points. Sarah felt her hope beginning to crumble once again. Then came the moment that would change everything. As continued his testimony, becoming more animated in his denial of the accusations, he stood up from the witness stand to make a point. His voice grew louder, more emphatic. "These are lies," he declared. "Complete and utter lies designed to turn my daughter against me." The judge called for order, asking to sit down and lower his voice, but caught up in his own performance, ignored the instruction. He continued standing, his voice rising further. "I won't be accused of." And in that exact moment, something extraordinary happened. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as his voice escalated, his controlled facade beginning to crack. He was no longer the grieving, wronged father. His face was flushed with anger, his hands clenched into fists. The judge, looking thoroughly annoyed, opened his mouth to demand that return to his seat. But in that precise moment, the moment when anger exploded into the courtroom, when the carefully constructed narrative of concerned fatherhood shattered like glass, something extraordinary occurred. Maya stood up. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that the entire courtroom seemed to pause mid-breath. All eyes turned toward the small 3-year-old girl who had just risen from her seat beside the testimony table. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. This wasn't planned. This wasn't part of their strategy. This was pure, spontaneous truth erupting from a child who had been waiting for her moment to speak. The judge started to speak, but before he could utter a word, Maya took a tentative step forward. Jasper, with the intuitive understanding that characterizes exceptional therapy animals, rose with her. He didn't pull on the leash or try to move away. He simply stood beside the child, his large frame providing an anchor, a source of strength and safety. Maya's small voice trembled as she addressed the courtroom. Everyone leaned forward, straining to hear the words of this tiny girl who was about to break open the entire case. "Daddy scares me," she said, her voice barely audible but absolutely clear in the silent courtroom. She looked directly at her father across the room, her 3-year-old eyes filled with a gravity that seemed impossible for a child so young to possess. His words hurt. His voice is loud and angry. His face went pale. His lawyer started to stand as if to object, but the judge held up his hand, silencing him with a look of sharp authority. Maya continued, gaining courage with each word. Jasper pressed gently against her leg, his warm presence a constant reminder that she was safe, that she was being heard. "I don't feel safe," Maya said, and then she paused, seeming to gather her words carefully. "When Daddy gets angry, I hide. I hide in my room. I don't come out." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. This wasn't coaching. This wasn't manipulation. This was a child, a traumatized, brave, desperate child, finally finding her voice. "Jasper makes me safe," Maya continued, reaching down to stroke the dog's fur. "Jasper doesn't scare me. Jasper's voice is quiet. Jasper's gentle. When Jasper is with me, I'm not scared anymore." The courtroom had become a tomb of absolute silence. Even the journalists who had been whispering notes to each other had gone mute. The court reporters' fingers had stilled over their keyboards. Everyone seemed to understand they were witnessing something profoundly important, something that transcended the usual mechanics of a custody hearing. "My mommy died," Maya said, and her voice cracked with the weight of a loss no 3-year-old should have to carry. "My mommy went away, but Aunt Sunny stays. Aunt Sunny is here, and Jasper is here. They make me feel safe." Stood frozen, his face a mixture of rage and panic. His lawyer was frantically whispering something to him, but he seemed unable to hear, unable to process what was happening. Judge sat back in his chair, his skepticism completely evaporated from his expression. He was watching Maya with an intensity that suggested he was witnessing truth in its form. The judge had spent 40 years on the bench, had heard thousands of cases, had become adept at detecting lies and manipulation. But what he was seeing now was not a coached child. This was authentic pain, authentic fear, authentic revelation. Maya turned to Sarah, and in that moment the child's small face transformed. A smile appeared, tentative but genuine. "Can I stay with Aunt Sunny?" she asked. "Can I stay with Aunt Sunny and Jasper?" Sarah stood up, unable to contain herself any longer, tears flowing freely down her face. She wanted to rush to the child, to hold her, to validate her courage. But she remained where she stood, understanding that this moment belonged to Maya, that this child was speaking her truth in the most powerful way possible. The judge leaned forward, addressing Maya directly with a gentleness that seemed to surprise everyone in the courtroom, most of all his lawyer. "Maya," Judge said, his voice soft but carrying throughout the courtroom, "thank you for being so brave and telling us the truth. You can sit down now." Maya, still holding Jasper's leash, calmly walked back to sit down beside Sarah. Jasper moved with her, settling beside the child with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the entire proceeding. The dog rested his head on Maya's lap, and the child's small hand began stroking his ears, a gesture of comfort being given and received simultaneously. The courtroom remained in stunned silence. His lawyer was frantically conferring with his client, who looked as though he might be physically ill. His face had gone from pale to flushed to almost gray. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse. "I think," Judge said slowly, "that we're done here. I need a 15-minute recess to compose my thoughts, but I believe I have heard all I need to hear." The judge rose and departed to his chambers. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters were rushing for the doors. Phones were appearing to call in updates. Attorneys were huddling in corners. But in the center of all this chaos, Sarah knelt beside Maya and held her close. Jasper leaned into both of them, creating a small island of peace and safety in a sea of turmoil. "You were so brave," Sarah whispered into Maya's hair. "You were so incredibly brave." "Jasper helped me," Maya replied simply. "Jasper made me feel brave." Appeared beside them and she was crying. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "That child spoke her truth. The entire courtroom felt it." James was shaking his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. "I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I have never seen a moment that powerful in a courtroom. That child just changed everything." His lawyer was frantically trying to speak with, who looked shell-shocked and defeated. The facade had crumbled. The performance was over. What remained was the undeniable reality of a child's authentic suffering and her desperate need for safety and love. When Judge returned from his chambers exactly 15 minutes later, his expression had transformed completely. He sat down at the bench with a gravity that suggested he had been doing serious thinking in those 15 minutes. "I have been wrong," he said, his words landing like thunder in the courtroom. "I came into this hearing with preconceived notions and skepticism. I allowed myself to be swayed by eloquent arguments and professional testimony that confirmed what I already believed. But I was wrong." He looked directly at Maya. "What I just witnessed was a child speaking her truth, uncoached, unscripted, and absolutely authentic. This child has clearly experienced significant emotional distress in her father's home, and she has found safety and healing with her aunt and with this animal." Then he turned to, "Mister, I am ordering immediate emergency protective custody to be transferred to Ms. Sarah, effective immediately. Your daughter will remain in her aunt's care pending a comprehensive investigation into the home environment from which she is being removed." The courtroom erupted, looked as if he might stand and object, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and held him in his seat. His mother, who had been sitting in the gallery supporting him, let out a small cry of anguish. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice cutting through the chaos, "there will be a full investigation by Child Protective Services. Ms., you are commended for your advocacy on behalf of this child. And," he glanced at Jasper with an expression of wonder, "I believe I owe an apology to this remarkable animal." Sarah clutched Maya to her chest, hardly believing what was happening. After months of fighting, after defeat and despair, after the system had repeatedly closed its doors against her, truth had finally broken through. Not through documents or testimony or professional evaluation, but through the authentic voice of a small child and the unconditional support of a faithful dog. As Sarah held Maya and Jasper, the three of them together in a small circle of peace amid the chaos of the courtroom, she understood something profound. Sometimes the most powerful form of testimony doesn't come from words prepared in advance or evidence carefully documented. Sometimes it comes from a child's pure, desperate need to be heard, amplified by an animal who understands suffering and offers only love in return. The weeks following the judge's ruling were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, investigations, and emotional adjustments. The emergency protective custody order was finalized, allowing Sarah to legally take Maya into her home immediately. Visitation rights were suspended pending the outcome of the Child Protective Services investigation. What had seemed impossible just days before had suddenly become reality. Sarah took 2 weeks off work to help Maya transition into her new home, a place that would now be her permanent residence. The first few nights were challenging. Maya experienced nightmares, sometimes waking up screaming, unsure of where she was. But each time, Jasper was there. The old dog would pad into the bedroom, jump onto the mattress, something he normally never did, and rest his head on the child's chest. And each time, the presence of the dog's calm, steady heartbeat seemed to ground Maya, reminding her that she was safe. Sarah documented these moments not for court purposes, but for her own peace of mind and for Maya's future. She knew that trauma didn't disappear overnight. The healing process would be long and there would be setbacks, but now, at least, they could heal together in a safe environment. The investigation into his home conducted by Child Protective Services revealed troubling patterns of neglect and emotional abuse that had gone unnoticed, or perhaps more accurately, unreported, for months. Neighbors reported witnessing angry outbursts directed at Maya. Her preschool teacher provided documentation of behavioral changes that aligned with the testimony she'd given in court. A psychiatrist who evaluated found him to have significant anger management issues and suggested he lacked the emotional capacity to parent a traumatized child effectively. 3 weeks after the hearing, was ordered to complete an anger management program and attend parenting classes before any custody rights could be restored. The investigation concluded that, while there was no evidence of physical abuse, the emotional environment of his home was toxic for a vulnerable child who had already experienced the trauma of losing her mother. But the impact of the case extended far beyond Maya. What had happened in that Denver courtroom was unprecedented locally, and the story had captured the imagination of advocates, legal professionals, and the general public. A week after the hearing, a local news station ran a feature on Sarah and Maya's case. The piece was sensitive and powerful, focusing not on the sensationalism of the dog in the courtroom, but on the importance of listening to children's voices and the power of therapy animals to help traumatized children communicate. The story went viral. Within days, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly. Legal advocates wanted to know about her experience. Therapy dog organizations wanted to collaborate on cases. Child Protective Services agencies wanted to understand how therapy animals could better be integrated into their work. Most touching were the messages from other families, parents and relatives who were fighting similar battles, who had felt unheard by the system, who suddenly had hope because Sarah's story showed that sometimes truth does break through. Sarah was offered a position with Voices Without Words, working as an advocacy coordinator. The organization wanted her to help develop protocols for matching therapy dogs with children in legal custody disputes. She accepted immediately, recognizing that her experience, painful as it had been, could now be channeled into helping other families. Became something of a mentor and friend. Together, they began presenting at legal conferences, educating judges and attorneys about the therapeutic benefits of animals and the importance of considering emotional support animals in family law cases. They weren't there to advocate for the use of dogs as courtroom props, but rather to explain how legitimate therapeutic work with animals could illuminate truths that might otherwise remain hidden. The dog didn't make Maya speak, Sarah would explain at these presentations. Jasper provided safety. He gave Maya the emotional foundation she needed to feel brave enough to speak her truth. The real power wasn't in the animal being in the courtroom. The real power was in a child knowing she had something beside her that believed in her, that made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. 6 months after the hearing, Sarah made the decision to formally adopt both Maya and Jasper. The adoptions were processed simultaneously, a symbolic gesture that recognized the inseparability of the three of them. On the day the adoptions were finalized, Sarah took Maya and Jasper to the courthouse steps, and they stood together for a photograph that would later appear in numerous publications about the case. Maya, now 4 years old, had blossomed in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Her nightmares had become less frequent. She was thriving in preschool, making friends, laughing freely. She had even begun drawing pictures again, bright, colorful drawings of Jasper, of herself, of Aunt Sunny. There was a lightness to her that hadn't been present before, a joy that seemed to compensate for all the suffering that had come before. Sarah moved them all to a larger home in Boulder, Colorado, a place with a yard where Jasper could run, where Maya could play safely, where the three of them could build a new life together. She left her previous job and committed herself fully to her work with Voices Without Words, dedicating herself to ensuring that other children in similar situations could access the therapeutic support that had saved Maya. A year after the final hearing, the local news did a follow-up feature. They filmed Sarah, Maya, and Jasper in their new home, the three of them playing in the backyard, the deep bond between the child and the dog evident in every interaction. The reporter asked Sarah if she had any regrets about the long, painful legal battle. "Every moment of pain was worth it," Sarah said simply, watching Maya throw a ball for Jasper to chase. "Because that pain led to this, to my daughter being safe, to her being able to heal, to her being able to just be a normal kid. That's worth everything." The case had unexpected consequences for the legal system in Colorado. Several judges began to more seriously consider requests for emotional support animals in family law proceedings. The State Bar Association developed new guidelines for attorneys representing children in custody disputes, emphasizing the importance of listening to children's voices and recognizing that emotional trauma, while sometimes difficult to document, was real and valid. Completed his anger management course and parenting classes, but the investigation determined that supervised visitation would be necessary before any unsupervised custody could be restored. The judge indicated that full custody restoration would depend on demonstrating sustained behavioral change over an extended period. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Sarah herself. The woman who had walked out of that first courtroom in tears, defeated and hopeless, had been transformed by the experience. She had learned that sometimes the system fails, sometimes evidence isn't enough, sometimes you have to take desperate, unconventional chances. But she had also learned that when you fight for what's right, when you persist despite repeated rejection, when you remain committed to a child's above all else, miracles can happen. 2 years after the hearing, Sarah was invited to speak at a national conference on child advocacy. She brought Maya and Jasper with her. On stage, as she told their story to an audience of hundreds of family law professionals, Maya sat beside her, stroking Jasper's ears. The dog remained calm and centered, a living symbol of the power of unconditional presence. "People often ask me what the turning point was," Sarah told the audience. "When did the judge finally listen? When did the system finally believe you?" And I always answer the same way. The turning point was when a 3-year-old girl found the courage to speak her truth, and a faithful dog reminded her that she wasn't alone. Sometimes we think we need more evidence, more testimony, more documentation. But sometimes what we really need is to listen to the voices of children, to create safe spaces where truth can emerge, and to understand that presence, whether from a loving aunt or a compassionate dog, is perhaps the most powerful form of advocacy we can offer. As Sarah spoke, she looked down at Maya, who was looking up at her with complete trust and love. Behind the child sat Jasper, his eyes reflecting the stage lights, his presence a constant reminder of all that they had overcome together. The courtroom that had once laughed at Sarah had become a place of transformation. A system that had repeatedly failed now listened. And in that listening, a family had been saved. A child had been given back her childhood. And an old dog had discovered a new purpose in his final years, the purpose of helping a traumatized child find her voice and her safety. That was the real victory. Not the legal ruling, though that mattered. Not the media attention, though that helped. The real victory was standing in that audience, watching a 4-year-old girl who should have been broken by trauma instead radiating joy and security, her small hand resting on the dog who had believed in her before anyone else did. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes justice prevails. Sometimes when you refuse to give up on a child, when you fight with everything you have, When you're willing to take desperate chances, sometimes miracles happen. And sometimes they come with four paws and a wagging tail.